Samuel chapter 2. We are going to start our study in the life of this man Samuel, starting off at an early age here. So this is right after he had been given to Eli. We'll go into the details here in a minute. 1 Samuel chapter 2. I probably should have said which Samuel. 1 Samuel chapter 2. We're going to study through the life of this man and see how the Lord used him mightily during his time there. Why don't we do this first? We're going to start in verse 11. I'm going to read down to verse 26. So 1 Samuel chapter 2, starting in verse 11, and it said, "And Elkanah went to Ramah, to his house, and the child did minister unto the Lord before Eli, the priest." And that child would be Samuel. Now the sons of Eli were sons of Belial. They knew not the Lord. And the priest's custom with the people was that when any man offered sacrifice, the priest's servant came, while the flesh was in the seething, or it was boiling, with a flesh hook of 3 teeth in his hand. And he struck it into the pan, or the kettle, or the cauldron, or the pot. All that the flesh hook brought up, the priest took for himself. So they did in Shiloh unto all the Israelites that came thither. Also, before they burnt the fat, the priest's servant came and said to the man that sacrificed, "Give flesh to the roast for the priest, for he will not have sodden flesh," or boiled flesh of thee, "but raw. And if any man said unto him, Let them not fail to burn the fat presently, and then take as much as thy soul desireth, then he would answer him, Nay, but thou shalt give it me now, and if not, I will take it by force. Wherefore the sin of the young men was very great before the Lord, for the men abhorred the offering of the Lord. But Samuel ministered before the Lord, being a child, girded with a linen ephod. Moreover, his mother made him a little coat, and brought it to him from year to year, when she came up with her husband to offer the yearly sacrifice. And Eli blessed Elkanah and his wife, and said, The Lord give thee seed of this woman for the loan which is lent to the Lord. And they went unto their own home. And the Lord visited Hannah, so that she conceived and bare 3 sons and 2 daughters. And the child Samuel grew before the Lord. Now Eli was very old, and heard all that his sons did unto all Israel, and how they lay with women that assembled at the door of the tabernacle of the congregation. And he said unto them, Why do ye such things? For I hear of your evil dealings by all this people. Nay, my sons, if it is no good report that I hear, or for it is no good report that I hear, ye make the Lord's people to transgress. If one man sin against another, the judge shall judge him. But if a man sin against the Lord, who shall entreat for him? Notwithstanding, they hearkened not unto the voice of their father, because the Lord would slay them. And the child Samuel grew on, and was in favor both with the Lord and also with men. Let's go in prayer to the Lord. Father, thank you so much again for your word, Lord, the recorded history that we have here about how you've worked in your chosen people, Israel, how you've worked through this man, though there were many wicked men around him in his life. We see him grow, as it says here. Lord, this morning I pray that our hearts would be ready to listen to what you have to show us from that personally, as you deal with us individually. Lord, and that we would listen to what you have to say and change and conform as you would have us to into the image of your Son. Lord, and as we prayed earlier, Father, if there's a soul here this morning that cannot confidently say that they know that they would go to heaven if they were to die, if they're not sure of their salvation, Father, I pray that you would burden their heart this morning, and they would see their need, and they would find the desperation of their position before you, and they would come to you in surrender. Again, we pray that you have your will done, and you be glorified in this morning's services. In Christ's name, amen. So we did not start in the very front of the book, obviously, since we didn't start in chapter 1. But since we didn't, I'd like to go through just a little bit of time, as is my custom, it seems to be, to give us some introduction to what's going on here, some context of what's going on. So Samuel, well, go to Hannah. Elkanah was Samuel's father and Hannah his mother. We actually spent some time on our Wednesday night services when we were looking through examples of prayer. We've gone through the majority of these verses before. But again, just as a reminder, you have this individual, Elkanah, who seems to be a godly man because he is going up yearly before the Lord, offering sacrifice as would be required of him. And he had Hannah as his wife, but as you'll read very early on in the first chapter, that he also had another wife, Peninnah. It was not uncommon in those days, and this was not a second wife situation where Elkanah had divorced. No, they were both his wives at the same time. It was polygamy. This was, as we've talked about before, common in the time there. This was not something that God said that he wanted done. It was never something that God said that he wanted a man to have more than one wife at the same time there. But nonetheless, this is the situation going on in the life here. So Hannah and Peninnah were at odds. We see, as you go through the first chapter, that Peninnah had children, but Hannah had not. The Lord had allowed her womb to not bear children. And in this whole time, her, and I don't really know what you would call her the other wife. I don't know if there's even a real terminology for it, but Hannah titles her adversary, so why don't we call her that? Peninnah, Hannah's adversary, constantly berated her and mocked her for not having children. And again, culturally and historically, this was a major thing. A wife wanted to bear children for their husband, but she could not because the Lord had shut up her womb at that time. And she went before the Lord as she went with her husband to do these sacrifices, and she prayed to the Lord and begged him. And we see in those early chapters that she wept before God, constantly praying there that she would be able to have a child, that she, for one, would be relieved of the burden of the constant adversity that she faced from this other woman. And in the process, Eli, this priest who would sit there and watch the goings on in the temple, or the tabernacle, saw Hannah as she was praying. That at a particular event, her mouth was moving, but no words were coming out, and he just assumed she was drunk. And a phrase was used here by her. She said, "I am not a daughter of Belial." We got that terminology as well as we go through the verses this morning about these two individuals that were Eli's sons, and they are titled and said to be sons of Belial. Their names are Hophni and Phinehas. You'll see that also in the early chapters of the book as well. But she says, "I am not that, and I'm not a child of Belial." We'll define what that means as we go into our text this morning, our passage this morning. But and that being the case, Eli realized she was heartbroken and desperate, and he had said, "May the Lord bless you with a child." That happens. In that time in her life, she bears Samuel, and she prayed in that prayer before she even had him. She begged God, "Give me a son, and if I can just have a son, I will give him to you forever." And just the fact that she could bear the child is all that she needed. And at that point, she made that promise to God: "If I can bear a child, I will give him to you to be a minister to you." And he was in the tabernacle as soon as she could give him away. We'll find out that she didn't release him until he was weaned from her. She wanted to hold on to him until she was weaned. And of course, what mother wouldn't? But she was faithful to that promise and that vow she made to God in the time there. And then at chapter 2, verses 1 through 10, you'll go through and you'll read this prayer and this praise she gives because of God's answer to her and giving her this child. So to that point, we have kind of the goings on, why we're going to study about him. We see God's interaction with Hannah and Elkanah in the process of answering prayer and giving them a son, and coming about there. Another thing that I want to mention just about the times that they lived in. This was then the latter time of the judges that God used, where he would pick individuals to kind of oversee and judge the land and make sure things were being done right. They were into the promised land. And again, anytime in the book of Judges, you'll realize that Israel, the nation, never really did well. They were constantly into idolatry. God would chastise them. They would come back and turn back to him, but that was a vicious cycle. And as is kind of common in defining what the times were like, Judges chapter 21, the last chapter in the book, and the last verse in the book says, in those days, so Judges chapter 21, verse 25, in those days there was no king in Israel. Every man did that which was right in his own eyes. So, could you call it anarchy? Probably to some degree. It was very, it was not a good time to live in. It was very worldly, especially for the nation of Israel and the idolatry that they consistently had there. So, Samuel. Samuel's name meant asked of God. Can you guess why that was the name given to him? Because Anna asked him of God, begged him. And again, that was another thing that was kind of common in those days, in that culture. It may be common too as well today, but a lot of times people name their children after events like that. There was Samuel. Isaac was named Isaac, which means, to some degree, laughter, because his mother kind of laughed at the fact that she was going to have a child at her old age, in her 90s. Sarah is. That was just another example of that being the case. But Joel is another example of a name that was given that related to God. But multiple, I could go on and on. That's not the point this morning. But so Samuel's name means asked of God. And wouldn't that have been a constant reminder for him? My mother had pleaded to God for me. And here I am. I'm an answer to prayer. So there's the what's going on in Samuel's life here. I've made mention of his the two men that were the priests in the temple at that time. Not Eli. Eli was an older man, very old actually. But his two sons were the ones that were priests ministering in the temple. And these two individuals were wicked, and that is an understatement. What we're going to see as we go through this life of Samuel, at least especially in this morning's sermon, is we're going to see a comparison, somewhat of a comparison between how Hophni and Phinehas are acting before God and how this, especially at this time, this child, Samuel, how his character and actions are before the Lord. Because he is just a child. And if you want to call it narrative here begins in verse 11. At the very second half of verse 11, it says, and the child did minister unto the Lord before Eli the priest. So here, starting in verse 12, as we go into it this morning, verses 12 through 17, we're going to see Samuel's priestly examples. Because here this child, and as any one of you would know, especially anybody that's been around children or raised children, they are constantly watching you. You're taking, I can look at my kids and I can say, when it comes to actions and things, that's me. Probably should have done that a little bit differently because now they're doing these things that, they shouldn't be or whatever. Or, oh, that's me over there. They get that from their father. You can see the example that we've been, or they get that from their mother, whatever be the case there. But the children they absorb their surroundings. They watch what's going on around them. And I'm talking specifically about children because this is the case for Samuel, but it's the same for us as adults. We still are influenced by those around us. We have a little bit more ability to fight those things off, especially as mature believers. We can say, all right, I'm in this environment all day long, but it's a bad thing, so I need to steer away from attitudes or steer away from actions. But with children, that isn't always the case for them. They are absorbing what's around them. So, saying all that, verse 12, we start to see Samuel and the priestly examples that are around him. So, it starts off in verse 12. Now the sons of Eli were sons of Belial. That's not saying that they were Eli's sons and then they had a second father. Some translations say that they were worthless men. And that's the whole idea. There's no real character of Belial that we're looking at, like there was this guy named Belial, or this god that was worshipped, and a pagan god or false non-existent god that was worshipped at the time. But the idea of it is a worthlessness, of lawlessness, of rebellion. You would never want that said of you. The one time that was used in the New Testament, it was basically a definition of Satan. And there was a comparison being drawn between Christ and following him, or following after Belial, or in that case, Satan, this absolute opposition against God. So here these two individuals were called just that. They were sons of Belial. So they were lawless. They weren't lawless in the sense of not knowing what was right and wrong. They chose to go against what they knew was right. So these two individuals were specifically disobedient, as we'll see, of the Levitical laws. The skill set isn't right, but the things that they were specifically supposed to follow because they were priests. They went against those things. And we'll get an example here as we move forward. But also, what else was said about these individuals? It says that they knew not the Lord. So, not only were they in rebellion, but they did not know him. They weren't surrendered to him. They weren't believers. This was no carnal Christian or carnal believer living out a bad life. These were individuals who just were not surrendered, or, if we can use the term, saved. So here, we can see, and again, to define this, in order to be, and anybody that spent time in the Old Testament will realize that the priestly office was not just something that they went and had a job interview and became a priest. They were born into a family, the Levites. And when they were a part of that family, therefore they carried out the duties of the priest. That was the way God set it up. So here we have an example. Yes, this is Old Testament law, but I think what we can draw from it is these two boys at one time, and men now, were in a position, or even in a family that had the responsibility to minister to God. But they did not guarantee that they were even going to believe in him. So we see that. We see it today. And just because your family goes to church doesn't mean that everybody there is a believer. You think of a lot of times when with parents who raise their kids up in the Lord to the best of their ability, as according to Scripture, and they choose to go a different way. They don't follow. So just because mom and dad are Christians and believers does not have any bearing on the child or the young adult or the adult child. We as Christians realize that we hang our salvation on our personal belief. Again, that's the point I'm trying to drive home right now, is it's not about who I knew, who I was involved with. I went to church and I was baptized when I was a child. It has nothing to do with that. It has to do with the fact that you have surrendered to Christ and accepted your need as a sinner for him to save you, because you couldn't do it. You couldn't throw up those things. Baptism, early, growing up, going to Sunday school. They mean nothing before the Lord. It's that surrender that we require, that the Lord requires. Verses 13 and 14. Here's that example. It says, "In the priest's custom with the people was that when any man offered sacrifice, the priest's servants came with the flesh, while the flesh was in seething, with a flesh hook of 3 teeth in his hand. And he struck it into the pan, or the kettle, or the cauldron, or the pot. All that the flesh hook brought up, the priest took for himself. So they did in Shiloh unto all the Israelites that came thither." So there is some provision that we see from God here. God's provision for the priests. Priests didn't have the responsibility of having a job outside of their office as priests. So therefore they had to be provided for. God in the Levitical laws set up things like this, for instance. This is how you would you'd be able to retrieve some meat so you could feed yourself as you're there ministering before me in the tabernacle and then later on in the temple. So it's defined there in verses 13 and 14 of God's provision in that. And they, as I said, they were dependent on those things. Those who brought the sacrifices couldn't argue against it because this is what God said I'm going to do. And we see that even today. No, we don't practice anything in the law. We don't do any of those things. Where the Lord took care of those who ministered consistently or constantly in their life that they had as a priest, the Lord also says something similar to that in the New Testament, as he's defined how his church works, as those who minister before the Lord, those who are elders, pastors, bishops, as those three words to mean one thing: the office of the one who's the shepherd of the church, I guess you could say, the under shepherd. They are taken care of by the church, so that they could spend time in the Word and preparing to feed the flock as God commanded Peter, as Jesus commanded Peter, and do all the other responsibilities that a pastor does in shepherding, taking care of the sheep. And just a side note of praise, I think Trinity does that very well. The Lord has blessed us with how He's blessed us as we give, and I find everyone is very faithful in that. To my knowledge, I'm not completely knowledgeable of everything. I choose not to be, but we have a giving church, and I wanted to take the moment to praise Trinity for that. Next, verses 15 through 17. Now we get into what these two men, Hophni and Phinehas, were involved in. So we see first God's provision in verses 13 and 14, and now we see the great sin that was involved with these two men. So starting in verse 15, it says, "Also before they burnt the fat, the priest's servants came." This is specifically Hophni and Phinehas' servants came and said to the man that sacrificed, "Give flesh to roast for the priest, for he will not have sodden flesh of thee, but raw." And he wasn't eating raw flesh. He was just saying, I don't want it cooked. I don't want it boiled. 16. "And if any man said unto him, let them not fail to burn the fat." So this is the response by those involved in boiling that food, or if they were going to give them the flesh raw. But they said, "Let them not fail to burn the fat presently, and then take as much as thy soul desireth." Then he would answer, this priest of these two men, "Nay," or "No, but thou shalt give it me now. And if not, I will take it by force." You see the violent mentality of these men. In verse 17, "Wherefore the sin of the young men was very great before the Lord, for the men abhorred the offering of the Lord." So here, their lawlessness, their worthless character, these sons of Belial is pictured here in how they are treating the offering, how they are treating what God had set as parameters of how to deal with this. And as was understood earlier, this is God's provision for the priest, and they scoffed at it and said, "I don't want boiled meat. I'd like to have something roasted on the fire. I want something cooked on a spit. I want something in the rotisserie, whatever, however you're going to cook it outside of boiling it. I'm not content with how God's going to provide for me here. I want to do it in the way I want it." And to the point where they said, "I'll take it from you violently if necessary. This is how we're going to do it." So again, we see the wickedness of these men, the vile character of these men who had a position to minister before the people through the sacrifice. And again, getting the gravity of what's going on here, this is an interaction with the Lord. These sacrifices were very detailed in how they were to be done, what was supposed to be given, and this is how they worshipped God. This is how they interacted with Him, and they scoffed at it. So their character is clearly defined here. And as verse 17 puts very well, it says in that time, first it calls this sin, this particular sin, a very great sin before the Lord. But honestly, that's just sin before the Lord. That's why, if all I've done, let's say, and this is impossible, let's say all I've done is told one little tiny lie. that sin is just as great before the Lord as it would be if I would profane his sacrifices here, as these men did. Sin before God has to be dealt with because it is always great before him. And then it says, closing up that verse in verse 17, for men abhorred the offering of the Lord. Their sin was great and displeasing to God. It was always before his eyes. We understand that out of Psalm 139 because he is ever present. He sees all things. There is no place for us to hide from him. And on top of that, it in the instance here, it scarred those who ever came to give to the Lord in this sacrifice. When they were, the nation was commanded to do this. And as they went up there at Shiloh to do this, the people who went up, they abhorred the sacrifice of God because of the way they were treated when they went up. Do you see how that sin affected not just Hophni and Phinehas, but it affected everyone that had to go sacrifice, because that's the nature of sin. It's not in secret. It doesn't have effects only upon the sinner. It always affects those around. Now, it may not affect immediately, but when it is exposed, it will have a detrimental effect upon those around. It scars. And it's not just the effect on those people, but they abhorred ultimately worshiping God as he asked them to do. It affected their relationship even of the Lord. Next, we'll see here in verses 18 through 21, we'll see Samuel. So we just saw Samuel's priestly examples, and we realized that those were horrendous. Now we'll see Samuel's parental examples. So starting in verse 18, it said, but Samuel ministered before the Lord, being a child, girded with a linen ephod. Verse 19, moreover, his mother made him a little coat and brought it to him for years, from year to year, when she came up with her husband to offer the yearly sacrifice. So enters the parents. Now the parents enter the scene here, if we'll say, as Samuel ministered before the Lord, as he was promised to do. And as I tried to kind of explain early on, the examples that his parents were to him in the very little time that they had with him. Because he got up, he went up to Eli, and to be left there after he had been weaned, so he's still just a baby. Yet he carried that name that reminded him of his parents and their choice to serve God, about a God who gave an answer to prayer. So there were examples here. And as we do this comparison this morning and see the distinction here, one thing to keep in mind as we go through this is his parents saw him yearly. Their godly example was, as much as they could give him, was on a yearly basis. Did they come more often than that? Possibly. I don't know. It says specifically they met him on the yearly basis. Hophni and Phinehas were with him daily. The wickedness of these men were before his eyes, his young, impressionable eyes, daily, because he was there in the tabernacle with them. And would they have hidden their sin? Doubt. I doubt that would have been their concern. So we see Hannah's persistent care in this, and as she, as this child was there, girded with that linen ephod, which was the clothing that was used there as they ministered in the temple. And moreover, it says in verse 19 that she made him a little coat and brought it to him year from year. So she kept making clothes for him. You see her love there. I mean, again, what mother, what good mother would not have tried to be involved in the way that she was, constantly providing for him? But what else did he see in that? He saw a consistent faith to the little degree that it was there that he saw them. She was up there yearly. Not just to see her son, but to present the sacrifices that were asked of her and her husband to do. And she saw that example of godly parents. I tell you, godly parents, godly grandparents, and godly family. I guess it kind of depends on how your family is and how they interact. Even when there's lots of impressions for children and individuals around them, the parental example seems to be the most important. It's the one that's really followed more frequently than that of the peers and things like that. It's a good example and a good reason for us as parents. I know there's just a few of us here at that point in our lives right now, but grandparents have the same responsibility, have that same opportunity, I should say. So we see that she constantly is there as much as she can be. And that consistent example of worship and provision that she could be involved in was a contrast to the pilfering example of these thieves that stole meat in a way that they shouldn't have from the sacrifices, denying God's provision but providing for themselves in their own wicked manner. That's Hophni and Phinehas. God's blessing in this is seen in verses 20 through 21. And it says, and Eli blessed Elkanah and his wife and said, the Lord give thee seed of this woman for the loan which is lent to the Lord. So this is talking about Samuel. You gave this child, you sacrificed ultimately there with this child. And may God give you more children. And they went unto their home, their own home. And the Lord visited Hannah so that she conceived and bare 3 sons and 2 daughters. And the child Samuel grew before the Lord. So here we see God's blessing there. Not only had he given her that great answer to prayer with Samuel, but he continued to do so with giving more children there. Maybe we can see it's because of the faithfulness. There's no doubt Eli saw their faithfulness there and saw and knew the situation with this young child that he had training to be a minister before the Lord. And he did what was not uncommon in those times. He blessed the family and would have prayed that God would continue to grow the family through Hannah and bearing children, and it happened. And then we see, as another encouragement, here Mom and Dad leave. They come back up the next year. And what's Samuel doing? Well, he's still serving the Lord. As it says there at the end of verse 21, and the child Samuel grew before the Lord. How encouraging was that for them? How terrifying would it have been to leave knowing of the wickedness that he was surrounded with day and night. And all that they could do, because she made a vow to God, I will give him to you, God. You're going to have to take care of him. And God is faithful. Even with all those bad examples around. So we can see, and we can say this. We can't always protect our kids, whether they're young, whether they're old. Because I know my dad, my mom pray for me all the time, making sure I'm making wise decisions and things like that, and I'm provided for. And I know you do that with your own children. We can always protect our children. Again, that's one thing I love about my dad. I mean, he just bends over backwards to make sure I'm taken care of. Didn't plan on mentioning that. We cannot always protect our children from harmful influences, but we do have the time that we have with them to be an example to them. As the Paytons and the Niedergalls have their family at home and have that responsibility to do everything we can to raise them up in the Lord and correct them where we can correct them now. All of your children aren't at home with you now, but you can constantly be that prayer, that constant encouragement when it's needed there, that constant, hey, son or daughter, you look like you're maybe struggling here, or you may want to think about this before you make a bad decision on this case. That's the examples that we can be. We have the time that we have with them, but we need to make sure as believers, as faithful, mature Christians, that we are investing at all points and at all times. Verses 22 through 25. This is my quick-witted title for here. Eli, a day late, $1 short for his kids. verses 22 through 25. And it says, "And now Eli was very old and heard all that his sons did unto all Israel, and how they lay with the women that assembled at the door of the tabernacle of the congregation. And he said unto them, Why do ye such things? For I hear of your evil dealings by all this people. Nay, my sons, for it is no good report that I hear. You make the Lord's people to transgress. If one man sin against another, the judge shall judge him. But if a man sin against the Lord, who shall entreat for him? Notwithstanding, they hearkened not unto the voice of their father, because the Lord would slay them." So don't wait on correction. If you see something as parents where there's a wrong direction, don't wait. Just get involved. Get there and say, you know what? As nagging as this may be, I'm going to address this now, instead of letting it slowly take its toll. Because Eli was late in this. He did not do what he was supposed to do. Their sins, as Eli was confronting him on this, not only were they stealing food in the way they shouldn't have stole food, but they went down to adultery and fornication in the temple, of all places. And it was before all people. This contrast, these wicked men, and Samuel, this child, would have known these things, these wicked examples that were going on around him. He saw these things, and Eli was getting involved for his son's sake. But also the people, this testimony, this information was being talked about amongst the people. It was open scandal. It wasn't hidden. And ultimately what it says there about them is they would not be corrected. They would not listen. And God was going to slay them for this wickedness. Verse 26. Godly obedience brings great profit. And here are those what I consider sweet words in light of the situation for this child. It says, "And the child Samuel grew and was in favor with both the Lord and also with men." So here is all these horrible examples. And this child, again, we don't know how old he is. Old enough to walk. Old enough to have a yearly have this coat being made for him as they came to see him. But Samuel, in the process of all this, grew in the Lord. He grew on and was in favor with the Lord. And not only that, but he also saw the blessing of, he was gaining trust amongst those around him. Samuel wasn't a priest. He wasn't going to take that job. As we go through here, we'll see, some have said he was a prophet for sure, but maybe he even had the responsibility of being a judge too. I think there's, I don't know if it's speculation or not, but at the moment that's where my mind's at. He may have had those two great jobs, and his choice to serve God and to follow him, and with all that was going on around him, was nothing but a benefit to him before the Lord and before men. So our environment does not determine our choices, because if anybody had a great excuse like that, Samuel did. I'm only doing bad things because these two great men of responsibility, Hophni and Phinehas, were just bad examples to me. But no, our environment does not determine our choices. We make those for ourselves. We can be surrounded by ungodliness and still grow in the Lord. It's never an excuse. And here, we are to be a light for God in our environment. If we are in that ungodly environment that we're in, and we are growing, then we are also to be a light. And He will use us. And we will see that through the life of this man as we go through a study. He did some, I was talking with Brent earlier, and I used the term crazy, and I didn't mean like bad or wrong. I just couldn't think of a better word to say. But he does some pretty amazing things. And even in what I'm thinking about, I'm not going to get into, I look at it and say, no, amazing wouldn't be the right word. But this is going to be a good study. He's going to be a great example for us. I'm going to see a man who stuck with the Lord, and he did what he was supposed to do no matter what was going on around him. He was a man by himself at times, but he served God because that was what he was going to do. Let's pray. Father, thank you so much for your word. Thank you for the introduction that we had this morning about this man, his surrender to you. But he was a child by all understanding through the verses that we went through. And even at that age, he decided to stand strong. Lord, may that we do the same thing. May we do that for your glory, and as we go out in our own lives this week, we would see opportunities to share the light from your word with the world around us.